He said you can call it a metaphor if you want to, but Paul had a demon to deal with. You know, when Jesus in Randy's lesson last week cast out that demon said that his name was Legion, maybe because there was 1,000 of them or whatever a Roman legion was in the man. But you know, I'm gonna name this demon that Paul was dealing with anger, because it's more like the demon, one of the demons that you and I probably deal with. You know, our lesson today is about a dramatic shift of a guy that was following the letter of the law, that changed himself into a guy that was, following the letter of the law. So he changed into one that went about following the intent of the law. The last lesson I taught contrasted Zacchaeus with the rich young ruler. You know, the rich young ruler claimed to be blameless when it came to following the law. Pretty much, he said, he didn't say use exactly these words, but he pretty much said he hadn't been lying, cheating, stealing, murdering, no adultery, or dishonoring his parents. Thought about that a little bit. If Jesus asked me that, I would have hoped that I would have thought to say, sometimes I'm blameless on these points, but certainly I can't claim to be blameless. And the reason I make this point is that before Saul's conversion to Paul, he pretty much saw himself in the same light as the rich young ruler saw himself. And he calls himself, Saul called himself a blameless Jew when he was telling about his life. If you can read it in Philippians 3, 4 through 6. And that's not exactly how Jesus saw Saul's life. And if it had been, there wouldn't have been a need for Paul to have to go through the big change that he went through on the road to Damascus. I think this Jesus replied to the rich young ruler applies to Paul as well, and I know it applies to you and me. Jesus said, no one is blameless except God himself. You know, some would say that Jesus changed Saul into Paul, but it may be more accurate to say that Jesus changed the way that Saul perceived himself. Perhaps that's why he had to go blind for a while, so he could see himself more clearly. From that point on in Paul's life, he saw himself as being highly flawed, not blameless. I don't think any one of us see ourselves as perfect, but we might not be as critical of ourselves as we should be, or we might not be as critical of ourselves as Jesus might be, and that would be a bad mistake. The Jews seem to have, you got two guys here that were Jews, and they seem to have let themselves be lulled into a false sense of security, a security that they call the law. They wrapped themselves in what they thought the law said, saw themselves as blameless. I look at that and I sometimes hope that we're not guilty of the same thing as people who come to church. We come to church on Sunday. Gee, I drove all the way from the lake to get over here and go to church, Is that good enough? I hope it helps, but what about if we tithe? Will that get the job done? what about really pursuing God's intent for our purpose in life? Probably that's more in line about what it's really about. This thing that in our scripture lesson today, I believe they called it the way. The focus of our lesson today is Paul, the apostle, is charged with bringing what they call the way to the Gentiles. That's us. Probably those other apostles started out focusing in on the Jews that were more like them. And Paul went about focusing on the Gentiles. Maybe the reason we're where we are with this is somewhat because of Paul's efforts. In today's society, I hear this word used some. They might have said about Paul or Saul, either one, that he had anger management issues. You know, some anger is necessary for survival. It's just a basic instinct or response to a threat. Intensity varies from person to person, I read. I never knew there were so many causes for anger or diagnosis for anger. I just really thought, you know, some people were cool as a cucumber and some people were hot-headed, and of course there's some in between. But when I think about Saul, Paul, on my own scale of 1 to 10, I'm gonna give him an 8.5 on anger. He had some. If he'd been a 10, just to clarify the scale I'm using, if he'd been a 10, I think Bob, instead of holding the coats for those guys that stoned Stephen, he'd have been up there throwing the first stone. That'd have been you're really number 10, hothead, angry person. They say one of the causes for anger can be depression. You know, I think some people deal with that all the time, but I think all of us deal with it from time to time. And it's a kind of thing that can sneak up on you sometime, and if you're not careful, it can make you get mad at God. And most of the time, the reason you do that is that question comes up to you like, why did God let this happen to me? Paul may have felt that, but really Paul, to me, if he may have had anger, but I don't think it was on account of depression, because he was nearly the most positive person I've ever seen. Paul said that he could be content in any situation, good or bad, and he found himself in some pretty dire situations, but he was comfortable talking to a ruler, he was comfortable talking to a soldier, he was comfortable being in jail, he was comfortable being in the presence of wealth. So another type of cause of anger is what they call obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. I wouldn't swear that Paul didn't have some of what folks that diagnose anger wouldn't call OCD. He might have been pretty high on the OCD scale, because when we first heard what Jim read there today, he was obsessed with the law. I mean, you don't go out there and start snatching people out of their houses and stoning them to death, throwing them in jail, if you're not obsessed with what you're doing. But after he had this experience on the road to Damascus, he was obsessed with spreading the word about Jesus after his conversion. It just shows that if you're obsessed with doing a good thing, How can you call it bad? They say that alcohol can trigger anger management issues, and I've been around some of that. I've seen some people, but yeah, I've seen it make people funny, mean, sad, stupid. But I doubt if alcohol abuse drove any of Paul's personality traits. Like some of the other people in the Bible, he may have had a glass of wine from time to time, but there's no indications that alcoholism or attributed to his personality very much. There's another thing called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, I learned. I read up on that a little bit, and what I figured out is I think I have that, pretty bad. It's marked by inattention, hyperactivity, or impulsive behavior. And the more I read about that, I'll just say I decided to give myself an 8.5 on the ADHD scale, the Bob scale of 1 to 10. But I can tell you this about that. I have my wife who is strong in being attentive, and she is never hyperactive, and she rarely acts impulsively. She likes to think things through. She likes peace and quiet. She knows how to listen. Things that I don't do well. And the good thing about it is that gives my life some balance. And when we look at Paul and think about Paul, I think that Luke, Dr. Luke, was the Amy in Paul's life. The book of Acts could have very well been the book of Paul, maybe if Paul had written it, but you know who wrote it? Luke wrote it, because he's the one that paid attention to all that and listened to it and recorded it, put it together, and brought it to us. I think Luke is the one that brought balance to Paul's life. God put Luke and Ananias and others in Paul's life for a reason, and we need to recognize those that God puts in our lives to counterbalance some of our weaknesses. And even more than that, we need to think about what we can do to how God puts us in other folks' life to maybe strengthen them. The lesson book says that the purpose of this lesson today is to let go of anger that blocks spiritual growth and relationships in the church. And I think, it's pretty accurate to say that we could apply some of that to our own church. Not only could we apply it in our church, it looks like to me, if you watch a little TV, pretty quickly you come to the conclusion we need to apply a little bit of that into our whole country. I'm so tired of hearing people spew anger toward each other with no solution being put forward. Just kind of raw anger about what they think. I'm okay with anger as long as it's channeled toward solutions rather than channeled toward spreading discord and hate. God put people in Paul's life to turn his weaknesses into strengths, not to spew more discord and hate. You know, there are several guys that displayed some anger in the Bible from time to time. I always thought that when Peter was in the garden, when Jesus was praying, when Judas betrayed him and those men came up on him, they said that Peter cut off a man's ear. Jesus put that ear back on. But Peter was either a lot better swordsman than I always pictured him as being, or I really believe he was trying to cut that man's head off, and that man ducked over a little bit and he cut his ear off. And you gotta admire Peter for standing up for Jesus there, but he was willing to make a stand, but it kind of, you know, many times it's easy to admire anger when someone takes a stand for another person. The kind that seems most frustrating is selfish anger. Some of my biggest disappointments in my own self arise out of selfish anger or just selfishness, period. I'm gonna skip over some of that. It sounds like to me I'm about to wear out anger and move on to what I thought. I've been fortunate. A while back I got Netflix, and fortunately it was before all this virus thing came and the Democratic and Republican convention came, and fortunately I didn't have to watch any of that. I had Netflix to watch. And so I watched a movie called Seabiscuit. I hadn't seen that. I really liked that movie. And I watched the Kentucky Derby yesterday. I watched it kind of in a different way, because after I watched that movie Seabiscuit, I realized how important the jockey was. I mean, I've never been a horse race man, but it looks like to me you just turn them out and the fastest one just runs around to the end, and that's the guy that gets the money, you know, and kind of a random deal. But that's really not how it seemed to work after I watched that movie. It seemed to be in that movie all about the direction that the jockey gave the horse. If you just turn them out and drive them hard as you can, that's probably the one that they run out there that they call the rabbit, that doesn't ever win the race. He just runs out there in the front about 3/4, and then those ones that have direction back there end up, you know, that horse fades and you don't even never know where he finishes. But anyway, I watched that and I thought about, you know, each one of those horses is different and they need a little bit of different direction. But if you give them the right direction and you hold them to the right point and you let them go toward what they were really born to do, they won't ever disappoint. And I think that they did kind of like Paul did when God gave him the right direction and turned him from just running hard in his life without direction, but with the direction that Jesus gave him. You know, he's one of the key ones that brought the message of Jesus to our people. And, you know, I think we need to think about that a little bit and make sure that each one of us knows what direction we have, and hopefully we can find that thing that we were put here to do and excel in that as well. Thank you.